How do you make a superorganism? Superorganisms are integrated collections of individuals who live together in a common society. How does natural selection build those? How does it orchestrate the construction of a superorganism? The superorganism, to William Morton Wheeler, the thing that constituted a superorganism were groups of individuals who were organized for nutrition, reproduction, and protection. And he was a myrmecologist, so he was primarily focusing on ant societies, but this has been generalized broadly. So how does an insect society evolve a complex social organization? It's a problem because there's no central control of behavior. There's no taskmaster running around and telling everybody what to do. There's no central genome. It's not a genome like in an individual. You can have selection on individuals for aspects of their genetic complement that can change in those across populations, and you can evolve specific traits. And there's a hierarchy of organizational levels that you have to work through. You have genes. The genes are the elements of change over time, the frequency of genes changing in a population as that population evolves. And the genes make proteins, and the proteins orchestrate with development to produce a physiology and a behavior that is then expressed in the individuals who then get together and there's some sort of a social organization. So a superorganism, the selection is on the social organization, way down here, far away from the genes that are actually under the selection. It's the gene frequencies for alternative alleles at different gene loci that change over time as a consequence of selection on this superorganism. The occurrence of social insects actually presented Charles Darwin with some specific difficulties. He talks about them in The Origin of Species in a section on objections to the theory of natural selection as applied to instincts, neuter and sterile insects. And there were 4 problems. The first one was the occurrence of sterile workers at all. How can you get individuals evolving who don't reproduce when the fundamental basis of evolution by natural selection is that some individuals who have certain characteristics are better able to survive and out-reproduce those individuals with different sets of characteristics, and those differences are actually heritable. Not only that, workers differ from reproductives. So you have some individuals who reproduce and some who don't, but they have the same genetic complement, the same genomes, the same genotypes, but yet you have them differing in their anatomy, physiology, and behavior. And workers themselves differ from each other. And that's really a big problem because they don't reproduce at all, and yet they're distinct. So how do they evolve these distinct traits? At the bottom, you can see a good example of the differences between workers and reproductives in the weaver ant. Huge differences, but yet there's no genetic difference. There's only the difference in the forms of the workers and the queens. The other difficulty that Darwin had was the perfection of the comb that was being constructed by worker honeybees. He looked at perfect characters and said, how can they evolve to be so perfect? And that was one thing to talk about the eye of an individual and how did it become so perfect over time, evolve in the evolution of the eye and the organism. A different kind of problem when you're looking at something that's perfect, so perfect that's actually a consequence of a collection of behavior and a division of labor that's taking place among individuals who are, for the most part, not reproductive. So he really struggled with the perfection of the comb of honeybees. He actually sent some comb off to a friend of his who was a mathematician at Cambridge, and he studied the comb and in all detail, and he wrote back to him that it was perfect. He said that and then Darwin wrote that for the comb of the hive bee, as far as we can see, is absolutely perfect in economizing labor and wax. This friend of his, who was a mathematician, showed that the wax comb was maximizing the storage ability for a comb. It was maximizing the strength of the comb for storing the honey and minimizing the amount of wax that it took in order to hold and store that particular amount of honey safely. And then he says, though this is effected by a crowd of bees working in a dark hive. So he really pondered the idea of how did a collection of individuals evolve to the point where they could work together in the dark and construct such a comb, when there's no one running around with a blueprint saying, do this, do that, you go over there and you put wax here, you take it away from there. This question also troubled Maurice Maeterlinck. Maeterlinck was a author, poet, playwright, Nobel laureate, who in 1901 published a wonderfully romantic book called The Life of the Bee, where he goes through and he's describing the behavior of bees and the changes in a colony throughout the season of starting with a swarm and then going through the season and swarming again. So it's a story of their life history. But he also pondered the question, how do they organize themselves? How do they do all this stuff that looks so organized and perfect and to us, but there's really nothing in there that's actually guiding them. They somehow manage to do this on their own. So he pondered the question, could it be the queen? Is she giving instructions? Is that what's leading to this kind of coordinated behavior that we observe? But he wrote, she is not the queen in the sense in which men use the word. She issues no orders. She obeys as meekly as the humblest of her subjects. The massed power, sovereignty-wise, that for the present, until we attempt to locate it, we will term the spirit of the hive. So he sort of said, I don't know what it is. It's not her. Whatever it is, we'll just call the spirit of the hive for right now. What is the spirit of the hive? Well, there's been a lot of studies done over the years, and really what it all points to is that the spirit of the hive is basically algorithms of individual behavior. So you have individuals working together to accomplish these group traits that sort of emerge from the social interactions or the interactions of individuals. But key to it is the stimulus behavioral response relationships and the correlation of response and stimulus. So what do I mean? Individuals in the hive, bees, workers, they walk around in the hive and they encounter stimuli from their environment. They sense these stimuli and they respond behaviorally. When they respond behaviorally, they change the stimulus. And you'll see more of this in a minute. They change the stimulus in a way that then changes the behavior of others around. And so you get a division of labor and you accomplish colony-level tasks. Underlying this is the stimulus threshold model of complex social behavior. So you can look at the honeybee down here in the left corner. She's covered with hairs and sensilla. These are sensory devices that sample the environment and bring the information from the environment into the bee. So these sensillae, they all have fundamental neurons that are attached to them. They get fired and produce action potentials that fire down the axon and go into the central nervous system someplace where they're processed, or they'll go directly to a muscle that will then respond. So constantly they're sampling a stimulus, and if a stimulus is sufficient to fire this action potential through this neuron, then it goes into the brain and it gets integrated and it results in some kind of a behavior or no behavior. The diagram here shows a stimulus level, just whatever it could be. I'll give examples in a minute, but some stimulus that's at some level in the nest. And you've got different individual bees that have different thresholds to that stimulus. So an individual that has a low response threshold, like this one here or this one here, the lower ones, their response threshold lies below what the stimulus level is at inside of the nest at a given time. So when they encounter a stimulus, they respond because their response threshold is low. The stimulus exceeds it. They respond to the stimulus because the stimulus exceeds their response threshold. These individuals here, their threshold of response is higher. It takes more of a stimulus before they will actually respond to the stimulus. And then the rest of the story is then the action of responding to the stimulus actually can modulate the stimulus level, which then affects other individuals. So here's a real world example. And I don't mean this to be sexist, but this is actually this is my family, supposedly. Okay, so there's a stimulus building up in the kitchen, and that stimulus is dirty dishes, and they're piling up. And you have two individuals. This individual has a low response threshold. It doesn't take much stimulus before that individual will respond to it and act on it. And the other individual has a high response threshold. Eventually, this individual would respond, but it's just going to take a bigger stimulus before they'll respond. This individual, when they respond to the stimulus by washing the dishes, changes the stimulus. It modifies the stimulus level. It drives that stimulus down to be lower. And so this individual here is going to be way below this individual's threshold. And other individuals who may have threshold levels for dirty dishes that may be between this individual and this individual. So this is a way that the correlation with the response and the stimulus level can then drive a division of labor. So one individual will repeatedly do the same act as the dishes pile up, they'll be washed, and the other individual will never perform that task and can do something different and engage in a different kind of task.